Missing boy found after years. The father discovers a horrible truth. Robert stared at the phone in his hand, his coffee going cold on the desk beside him. Papers were scattered everywhere, missing person reports, old newspaper clippings, and printed emails from various police departments. His living room had turned into what looked like a detective's office, with pins and strings connecting photos on a large cork board that took up most of the wall. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The evening sun cast long shadows through the blinds he hadn't cleaned in months. Time had become a blur since Leo disappeared. 5 years, 2 months, and 13 days. He didn't need to check his calendar anymore. The numbers were burned into his mind like a permanent scar. He picked up a photo of Leo from his 10th birthday party. The boy's smile was wide, showing off the gap where he'd lost his front tooth the week before. They'd gone to the zoo that day, and Leo wouldn't stop talking about the penguins. "Dad, did you know they mate for life?" he'd asked, his face pressed against the glass of the exhibit. Robert remembered laughing, ruffling his son's hair, telling him they'd come back next weekend. They never did. The missing persons detective had been sympathetic at first. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Thompson," she'd say, but as weeks turned into months, the calls became less frequent. Robert quit his job at the accounting firm after the first year. His boss had been understanding, offering him extended leave, but Robert couldn't focus on spreadsheets and tax returns while his son was out there somewhere. His sister Jenny tried to help. She'd come by with groceries, clean up a bit, try to get him to go out for dinner. "You need to take care of yourself, Rob," she'd say. "Leo needs you to be strong." But eventually, even Jenny's visits became rare. He knew she hadn't given up on Leo, but she'd given up on him. The cork board had become his life's work. Every possible lead, every similar case in the country, every reported sighting, he documented everything. The local police probably thought he was crazy. He'd shown up at the station so many times that Officer Martinez started keeping a coffee cup just for him. "You should talk to someone," Martinez had suggested last week. "There are support groups for parents who dash," but Robert had cut him off. He didn't need a support group. He needed his son. His phone buzzed again, making him jump. Probably Jenny, checking if he'd eaten today. He almost didn't answer. He'd gotten tired of lying about taking care of himself. But something made him pick up the phone this time. "Hello." His voice was rough from disuse. "Is this Robert Thompson?" The voice was unfamiliar. Male, maybe middle-aged. "Yes, who's this?" There was a pause, just long enough to make Robert's heart skip a beat. "Mr. Thompson, I'm calling about your son, Leo." Robert's hand tightened on the phone. He'd received calls like this before, psychics claiming they could help, scammers trying to get reward money, well-meaning people who thought they'd seen Leo but were always wrong. "What about my son?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but the tremor was there, just like always. "We've found him." 3 words. Just 3 simple words, but they made the room spin. Robert grabbed the edge of his desk, knocking over the cold coffee. The liquid spread across his papers, but he barely noticed. What did you say?" "We've found Leo," the voice repeated. "He's alive, Mr. Thompson." Robert's legs gave out, and he sank into his chair. The phone felt slippery in his sweating hand. How many times had he imagined this call? How many dreams had started this way, only to leave him waking up in tears? "This isn't funny," he managed to say. "If this is some kind of joke, dash." "It's not a joke, Mr. Thompson. I represent an organization that helps locate missing children. We've been working with local law enforcement for the past 3 months. We wanted to be absolutely certain before we contacted you." Robert's free hand found Leo's birthday photo, his fingers tracing the familiar edges. How do I know this is real?" "Leo has a small birthmark behind his left ear. It looks like a tiny heart. He broke his right arm when he was 7, falling from the treehouse in your backyard. And he was wearing a blue Pokemon t-shirt the day he disappeared." The room seemed to tilt. Nobody knew about the birthmark except family. It wasn't in any of the police reports or news stories. Robert had always said it looked like a heart, but Leo insisted it was shaped like a guitar pick. "Where is he?" Robert's voice cracked. "Please, I need to see him." "We need to handle this carefully, Mr. Thompson." Leo has been through a lot. We're working with specialists who can help with the transition. Can you meet us tomorrow? Tomorrow. After 5 years of endless tomorrows, each one exactly like the last, suddenly tomorrow meant something. Yes, of course. Where? The caller gave him an address, a facility about an hour outside the city. Robert scribbled it down on the back of an envelope, his handwriting barely legible. 9 a.m., the voice said. And Mr. Thompson? Try to prepare yourself. Leo, he's not the same boy you remember. The call ended, leaving Robert in silence. His eyes moved across the cork board, 5 years of dead ends and false hopes pinned to his wall. His hand was still shaking as he reached for his phone again, this time dialing Jenny's number. It rang 4 times before she answered. Rob? Are you okay? Jenny? He couldn't get the words out. How could he tell her? How could he put this moment into words? Rob, you're scaring me. What's wrong? They found him, he whispered. They found Leo. The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like hours. Then he heard it, the same shaky breath, the same disbelief he was feeling. Are you sure? Jenny's voice was thick with emotion. Rob, are you absolutely sure? They knew about his birthmark, Jenny, the one behind his ear. They knew about the treehouse accident. He heard her start to cry, and for the first time in years, his own tears felt different. Not the usual tears of grief and desperation, but something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. I can be there in 20 minutes, Jenny said. Don't move, okay? Just stay there. Robert looked around his living room at the scattered papers, the spilled coffee, the years of searching spread out around him. He's alive, Jenny, he said, more to himself than to her. My boy is alive. After hanging up, Robert sat in the growing darkness, Leo's photo clutched in his hand. Tomorrow. He would see his son tomorrow. The thought was both wonderful and terrifying. What had happened to Leo in these 5 years? What had he been through? The caller's warning echoed in his mind. He's not the same boy you remember. But he was alive. After 5 years of not knowing, of imagining the worst, of waking up from nightmares he couldn't shake, Leo was alive. Robert stood up, his legs steadier now, and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, normal, unchanged. But everything was different now. Tomorrow he would see his son. Robert barely slept that night. Jenny had stayed until midnight, making calls to family members, helping him clean up the coffee-stained papers, and trying to keep him calm. But after she left, the house felt too quiet, too empty, just like it had for the past 5 years. Only now the silence felt different, charged with possibility and fear. He got up at 4 in the morning, unable to stay in bed any longer. The drive was only an hour, but he couldn't risk being late. He showered for the first time in days, cutting himself twice while shaving with trembling hands. Standing in front of his closet, he spent 20 minutes trying to decide what to wear. What do you wear to meet your missing son after 5 years? He settled on a blue button-down shirt, Leo's favorite color. The shirt hung loose on his frame. He had noticed how much weight he'd lost over the years. Jenny had brought him a new jacket last Christmas, tag still on. He put it on, trying to look like someone who hadn't spent the last 5 years falling apart. The drive felt endless. He left at 6:30, stopping twice to throw up at rest areas. His GPS said he'd arrive 45 minutes early, but he couldn't make himself drive any slower. The facility was in a quiet area, set back from the main road. The building looked more like a large house than an institution, with well-kept gardens and a wheelchair ramp leading to the front door. Robert sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. He'd brought Leo's photo, the birthday one, but left it in the glove compartment. The caller's warning kept playing in his head. He's not the same boy you remember. Would Leo recognize him? Would he want to see him? At 8:30, he couldn't wait any longer. The reception area was warm and softly lit, with comfortable-looking chairs and potted plants. A woman at the desk looked up as he entered. Can I help you?
I'm Robert Thompson.
I'm here too. His voice caught. I'm here to see my son. Her expression softened with recognition. Of course, Mr. Thompson. Please have a seat. Dr. Carter will be with you shortly. Robert sat, then stood again, then sat. His legs wouldn't stop bouncing. An elderly couple walked past, the woman giving him a gentle smile. Were they here for someone too? How many other families had sat in these chairs, waiting to face whatever waited behind those doors? Mr. Thompson?
He jumped.
A man in his 50s, wearing khakis and a sweater vest, stood in the doorway. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses.
I'm Dr. Carter.
Would you come with me? Robert followed him down a hallway lined with abstract paintings in soft colors. Dr. Carter led him into a small office and gestured to a chair. Before you see Leo, we need to discuss a few things. Dr. Carter sat behind his desk, folding his hands. I know this is difficult, but I need you to listen carefully. Robert nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. Leo was found 3 months ago during a raid on a compound in northern Wisconsin. The organization that held him was... Dr. Carter paused, choosing his words carefully. They specialized in psychological manipulation of children. We've been working with Leo since then, trying to help him process his trauma. What did they do to him? Robert's voice came out as a whisper. We're still piecing that together. Leo has difficulty distinguishing between reality and the false narratives he was fed. He's been diagnosed with complex PTSD and shows signs of dissociative disorder. He has very few clear memories of his life before the compound. Each word felt like a physical blow. Robert gripped the arms of his chair. Are you saying he doesn't remember me? He remembers having a father, Dr. Carter said gently. But his memories are fragmented. The people who took him, they tried to convince him that his early memories weren't real, that they were his true family. Robert stood up suddenly, startling them both. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, a squirrel was burying something in the garden. Such a normal thing to see on such an impossible day. I need to see him, Robert said, still facing the window.
Please.
I've waited 5 years. Of course. Dr. Carter's chair creaked as he stood. But I need you to understand something first. Leo's behavior might seem unusual. He might not react the way you're hoping. It's crucial that you don't push him or show any strong emotional reactions that might overwhelm him. Robert turned back, nodding. He'd agree to anything right now. Sometimes, Dr. Carter continued, he speaks about his time in the compound as if it were a dream. Other times, he insists his life before was the dream. We're working with him to separate fact from fiction, but it's a slow process.
How?
Robert swallowed hard. How should I act? What should I say? Just be gentle. Let him set the pace. If he seems distressed or withdraws, don't take it personally. This is just a first step in what will be a long journey. Robert followed Dr. Carter through more hallways. They passed a room where several people were doing art therapy, another where someone was playing piano. Everything seemed so peaceful, so normal. How could this be the place where his son, his Leo, had ended up? They stopped outside a door marked Meeting Room 3. Dr. Carter turned to face him. Are you ready?
No.
How could anyone be ready for this? But Robert nodded anyway. Remember, Dr. Carter said softly, he's been through things we can't imagine. Whatever happens in there, stay calm. The room was small but bright, with 2 comfortable chairs and a small table between them. And there, sitting in one of the chairs, was a teenager Robert almost didn't recognize. Leo had grown so much. His dark hair was longer now, falling over his forehead. He was thin, too thin, but tall, almost as tall as Robert. He wore a plain gray sweater and jeans, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't look up when they entered. Leo, Dr. Carter said gently, your father is here. Robert's legs felt like they might give out. He gripped the doorframe, staring at his son. Leo's face had lost its baby fat, revealing cheekbones that looked like Jenny's. But his eyes, when he finally glanced up, they were the same deep brown Robert remembered, the same eyes that used to light up at the sight of Christmas presents or penguin exhibits. Hello, Leo, Robert managed to say. His voice sounded strange in his ears. Leo looked at him, then quickly away, then back again, like he couldn't decide where to focus. His fingers twisted together in his lap. You can sit down, Mr. Thompson, Dr. Carter said. Robert moved to the empty chair, trying to make his movements slow and non-threatening. Up close, he could see the birthmark behind Leo's ear, the tiny heart that Leo had insisted was a guitar pick. It was like a punch to the gut, that small proof that this was really his son. I'll give you some time, Dr. Carter said. I'll be right outside if you need me. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Robert alone with the stranger who was his son. Leo was looking at his hands now, his shoulders slightly hunched. I've missed you so much, Robert said quietly, fighting to keep his voice steady. I never stopped looking for you. Leo's fingers tightened around each other. Dr. Carter said you would come, he said. His voice was different, deeper, with a slight hesitation between words, like he had to think carefully before speaking. Yes, Robert said. I came as soon as they called me. I've been waiting for this day for so long. Leo glanced up again, studying Robert's face. You look like the pictures, he said. The ones they showed me, but different too. I'm older now, Robert said. 5 years is a long time. 5 years, Leo repeated, as if testing the words. They told me it was all a dream, the before time. They said I'd always been with them. Robert's heart clenched, but he kept his voice calm. It wasn't a dream, Leo.
You lived with me.
We went to the zoo. You loved penguins. Do you remember the penguins? Something flickered across Leo's face. Recognition? Fear? And then was gone. Sometimes I dream about penguins, he said. But they said dreams aren't real. Some dreams are memories, Robert said carefully. Real things that happened. Leo's hands twisted harder. How do you know what's real? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the years and pain it carried. Robert wished he had a better answer, something wise and healing. But all he had was the truth. I know you're real, he said. I know you're my son. Everything else, we can figure it out together. Leo looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, and Robert held his breath. Then Leo nodded, just slightly, and some of the tension left his shoulders. It wasn't much. It wasn't the joyful reunion Robert had imagined in his dreams. But it was something. It was a start. And after 5 years of nothing, a start was everything. The room felt smaller with each passing minute. Robert watched Leo's hands. They hadn't stopped moving, fingers weaving together and apart like anxious birds. He wanted to reach out, to grab those hands and hold them still, to anchor his son to this moment. But Dr. Carter's warning echoed in his mind. Don't push. Would you like some water? Robert asked, noticing a pitcher on the side table. Leo nodded, still not making eye contact. Robert's hand shook slightly as he poured 2 glasses, spilling a few drops on his new jacket. Here you go, he said, placing 1 glass within Leo's reach rather than handing it to him directly. Leo took it with both hands, like a child would, and Robert's mind flashed to kindergarten days. Leo drinking from cartoon cups, making a mess at dinner time. Thank you, Leo said, his voice formal, like he was speaking to a stranger at a bus stop. In a way, Robert supposed he was, You're welcome. Robert took a sip from his own glass, trying to think of what to say next. 5 years of imagined conversations, and now his mind was blank. Do you like it here? Leo's eyes darted around the room, taking in the soft blue walls, the landscape painting, the window with its view of the garden. It's quiet, he said finally. Not like the compound. Robert's grip tightened on his glass. He wanted to ask about the compound, wanted to know everything that had happened to his son. But Dr. Carter had been clear. Leo would share when he was ready, if he was ever ready. Quiet can be good, Robert said instead. They let me have books here, Leo continued, his voice a little stronger. Real ones, with stories. At the compound, we only had the teachings. What kind of stories do you like? Leo's fingers finally stilled on his glass. There's one about a boy who lives in a maze. He doesn't remember how he got there, but he keeps trying to find a way out. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Sometimes I feel like that boy. Robert felt tears threatening and blinked them back hard. I used to read to you, he said carefully. When you were little, you loved this book about a cat who wore a hat. Dr. Seuss, Leo interrupted, then looked surprised at himself. I remember colors. Red and white stripes. Yes. Robert leaned forward slightly, hope blooming in his chest. The Cat in the Hat. You knew all the words by heart. You used to correct me if I tried to skip pages. For a moment, something like a smile touched Leo's lips. Then it was gone, replaced by that distant look again. They said those memories weren't real, that they were implants. Implants. False memories, they said. Leo's hands started moving again, more agitated now. They said my real family saved me from the false ones, that everything before was a lie to confuse me. Robert felt sick. He thought of Leo, younger and smaller, being told that his whole life was a lie, being taught to doubt every happy memory, every moment of love. Your name is Leo James Thompson, Robert said softly. You were born on March 15th at St. Mary's Hospital. It was snowing that day, even though it was spring. The nurse wrapped you in a blue blanket, and you wouldn't stop crying until your mom held you. Leo's hands froze again. My mom. Sarah. She. Robert paused, unsure how much to say. She passed away when you were 4. Cancer. You probably don't remember much about her. Even before? Everything. I dream about someone singing, Leo said, his voice distant. A lullaby about stars. But they said that was just programming. Your mom sang Twinkle, Twinkle to you every night. Robert's voice cracked despite his best efforts. Even when you said you were too old for lullabies, she'd sing it anyway. Said it was her right as a mom. Leo lifted his glass again, taking a small sip. His hands were trembling slightly. How do I know? He asked, not looking up. How do I know what's real? It was the second time he'd asked this question, and it hurt just as much as the first. Robert wished he had a better answer, something that would cut through all the lies and manipulation, something that would bring his son back completely. I have pictures, he said.
Videos.
Birthday parties and Christmas mornings. School plays. Your Aunt Jenny, you remember Jenny? She kept everything. Every drawing you made, every report card. They showed me pictures too, Leo said. At the compound. Different pictures. They said those were the real ones. Robert felt a surge of anger, so strong it made him dizzy. He wanted to find the people who had done this to his son, who had twisted his mind and stolen his trust. But anger wouldn't help Leo now. The pictures I have, Robert said carefully, they show your whole life. Not just moments. They show you growing up, changing. They show your birthmark getting bigger as you grew. They show the scar on your knee from when you fell off your bike learning to ride. They show everything. Leo's hand moved unconsciously to his right knee. I have a scar, he said quietly, from the bike accident. You were 6. You refused to wear the knee pads because they weren't cool. When you fell, you were more upset about ripping your new jeans than about the cut. Something flickered in Leo's eyes, recognition? Memory? But it was gone before Robert could be sure. A knock at the door made them both jump. Dr. Carter poked his head in. How are we doing? Leo's posture changed instantly, becoming more rigid, his hands clasping tightly in his lap. Robert recognized the gesture of someone trying to appear normal, controlled. How many times had Leo had to do that in the compound? We're okay, Robert said, trying to keep the disappointment out of his voice. He wasn't ready for this to end, not when they'd just started talking. Leo has group therapy in 10 minutes, Dr. Carter said gently. But you can come back tomorrow, Mr. Thompson, if that's all right with Leo. They both looked at Leo, who was staring at his hands again. After what felt like forever, he gave a tiny nod. Same time, Robert asked, trying not to sound too eager. That would be fine, Dr. Carter said. Leo, why don't you head to the group room? I'll walk your father out. Leo stood up, his movements careful and precise. At his full height, he was just an inch or 2 shorter than Robert. When had that happened? When had his little boy grown so tall? Goodbye, Leo said formally, still not making eye contact. Thank you for the water. Goodbye, Leo, Robert said. I'll see you tomorrow. Leo walked out, his steps measured, like he was walking on ice. Robert watched him go, memorizing everything. The way he moved, the slight curl at the nape of his neck, the too thin wrists extending from his sweater sleeves. His son, a stranger, both at once. Dr. Carter led Robert back through the hallways, past the art therapy room where someone was now playing guitar softly. The music made Robert think of Leo's old guitar pick collection. He'd kept them in a small tin box under his bed. He wondered if that box was still there, gathering dust with all of Leo's other abandoned treasures. "You did well," Dr. Carter said as they reached his office. "Would you like to sit for a moment?" Robert nodded, suddenly aware that his legs were shaking. He sank into the same chair he'd sat in earlier, though it felt like days had passed since then. He remembered some things, Robert said. The Dr. Seuss books, his mother's lullaby. That has to mean something, right? Dr. Carter sat down, adjusting his glasses. Memory is complicated, especially in cases like Leo's. The people who held him, they didn't just try to erase his memories. They tried to replace them with new ones. The pictures he mentioned, Robert said. The ones they showed him at the compound.
Yes.
It's a form of gaslighting, making someone doubt their own reality. They would show Leo photos that were doctored to include him in their family events. They kept telling him his memories of you were false, implanted to test his loyalty. Robert felt the anger rising again. How could anyone do that to a child? The organization that took Leo, they believed they were saving children from what they called the corrupt outside world. They saw themselves as saviors, not kidnappers. Dr. Carter's voice was carefully neutral, but Robert could hear the disgust underneath. Did they? Robert had to stop, gather himself. Did they hurt him? Physically? We haven't found evidence of physical abuse, but the psychological trauma is severe. Leo was taught that doubting their teachings meant he was weak, corrupted. He's still struggling to trust his own thoughts. Robert thought of Leo's careful movements, his formal speech, the way his hands couldn't stay still. What can I do? How do I help him remember what's real? Don't push too hard for memories, Dr. Carter advised. Let him set the pace. Share stories if he seems receptive, but don't be disappointed if he can't or won't confirm them. Right now, he needs to know that you'll be here regardless of what he remembers. I've missed 5 years, Robert said, his voice rough. I don't want to miss any more. This isn't a race, Mr. Thompson. Leo's recovery will take time. There will be good days and bad days. The fact that he agreed to see you tomorrow is already significant progress. Robert nodded, trying to hold on to that small victory. The way he talks, it's so different. At the compound, they had strict rules about speech and behavior. Everything was formal, controlled. It will take time for Leo to feel comfortable expressing himself naturally again. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly. But the fact that he shared his thoughts about the book he's reading, about feeling like the boy in the maze, that's a good sign. He's trying to communicate his experience in his own way. Will he ever? Robert couldn't finish the question. Will he ever be the same? Dr. Carter finished gently.
No.
Too much has happened. But that doesn't mean he can't heal, can't build a new relationship with you. It just might look different than what you remember or expect. Robert thought of Leo's hands on the water glass, holding it like a child while speaking like an adult. Everything about him was a contradiction, familiar and strange, present and distant, his son and a stranger. I should call Jenny, Robert said, standing up. She'll want to know how it went. Take care of yourself, Mr. Thompson. This is a lot to process. In the parking lot, Robert sat in his car for a long time, staring at the building. Somewhere inside, Leo was in group therapy, probably sitting with the same careful posture, speaking with the same measured words. Was he thinking about their meeting? About the memories that had surfaced? Or was he trying to push them away, afraid they were more implants, more lies? Robert pulled Leo's birthday photo from the glove compartment. The smiling boy with the missing tooth seemed to belong to another lifetime now. He touched the image gently, then put it back. That Leo was gone. But this new Leo, with his quiet voice and troubled eyes, was still his son, still needed him. As he drove home, Robert thought about what Dr. Carter had said about letting Leo set the pace. It went against every parental instinct he had. He wanted to rush in, fix everything, make it all better right now. But that wasn't what Leo needed. What Leo needed was patience, consistency, proof that some things, like a father's love, could be real and lasting even when everything else felt uncertain. Tomorrow he would come back, and the day after that, and every day Leo would allow, until maybe, someday, those careful hands would relax, those guarded eyes would warm, and his son would find his way out of the maze they'd trapped him in. It wasn't the reunion he'd dreamed of for 5 years, but it was real. And for now, that had to be enough. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Robert would arrive at the facility at 9 every morning, sit in the small blue room, and wait to see what version of Leo he would meet that day. Some days, Leo would talk about the books he was reading, his voice gaining strength as he described different stories. Other days, he would barely speak at all, staring out the window as if searching for something in the distance. Today was one of the quiet days. Leo sat in his usual chair, wearing a different gray sweater. He seemed to have several identical ones, and watching a robin hop around the garden outside. "I brought something," Robert said softly, trying not to startle him. He pulled out an old photo album, one he'd spent hours debating whether to bring. Dr. Carter had said it might help, but also warned him to be prepared for any reaction. Leo's eyes flickered to the album, then back to the window. "More pictures? If you want to see them. We don't have to." The robin outside found a worm and flew away. Leo's hands did their familiar dance in his lap before he gave a small nod. Robert opened the album carefully. He'd chosen this one specifically. It was from when Leo was very young, before he could have any memories that conflicted with what they'd told him at the compound. "This is you at 2 months old," Robert said, pointing to a photo of a baby sleeping in a blue onesie. "You had colic. Wouldn't sleep more than an hour at a time unless someone was walking with you. Your mom and I used to take shifts, pacing the hallway." Leo leaned forward slightly, studying the photo. "The baby has the birthmark," he said, his voice neutral. "Yes." Robert turned the page. "And here you are at 6 months, trying to eat your own toes. You were very determined about it." A ghost of a smile touched Leo's lips. There, and gone so fast Robert almost missed it. "Babies are flexible. You were especially bendy." The pediatrician said she'd never seen a baby so intent on becoming a pretzel. They went through more photos. Leo's first steps, his first Christmas, his 3rd birthday party with a cake shaped like a dinosaur. Leo studied each one carefully, sometimes touching the edges of the photos with one finger, as if testing if they were real. "Your hair was lighter then," Robert said, pointing to a beach photo. "It darkened as you got older, just like your mom's did." At the compound, Leo said suddenly, his voice tight, "They said my hair was always dark. That light hair was a sign of impurity." Robert's chest ached, but he kept his voice steady. "Hair color changes naturally as children grow. It's very common. I have pictures of you every year. You can see it happening gradually." Leo's hands started their twisting again. They said a lot of things about what was pure and what wasn't, what was real and what wasn't. He paused, his fingers tangling together. "Sometimes I can't remember what they said anymore. It's all mixed up with other things." "That must be confusing," Robert said carefully. "Dr. Matthews, she's my therapist, she says it's okay to be confused. That my mind is trying to protect itself." Leo looked up briefly, then back at his hands. "But how can I trust my mind when it doesn't know what's real?" It was a variation of the same question Leo had been asking since their first meeting, but this time there was something different in his voice. Not just confusion, but frustration. "Can I tell you something about minds?" Robert asked. Leo nodded slightly. "They're not perfect. They play tricks sometimes, forget things, mix things up. That happens to everyone, not just you. The difference is, most people haven't had others try to use that against them." Leo's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" "Well, think about dreams. Sometimes they feel completely real while we're having them, right? But when we wake up, we can usually tell they were dreams. That's because our minds know the difference between dreams and memories, even if they feel similar." "But they said the memories were implants," Leo said, but his voice was less certain now. "Programming." "Leo," Robert said gently, "look at these photos. Really look at them. They show you growing up, changing naturally. Your hair getting darker, your face changing shape, your birthmark getting bigger as you grew. If someone wanted to fake these, they'd have to create hundreds of perfectly matched photos showing those gradual changes. Why would anyone go to that much trouble? Leo stared at the photos spread across the table. His fingers twitched like they wanted to start their dance again, but he kept them still. At the compound, he said slowly, they only had a few pictures. Maybe 10 or 12. Always the same ones. Because those were the fake ones, Robert said, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. This was the first time Leo had questioned anything about the compound so directly. Real life leaves more traces, like these photos or the videos at home or your old school reports. I went to school, Franklin Elementary. Your first grade teacher was Mrs. Chun. She had a hamster named Whiskers that you were always trying to sneak extra food to. Something flickered in Leo's eyes. Was the classroom green? Robert's heart leaped.
Yes.
Light green, with yellow curtains. You said it looked like spring. Leo closed his eyes, his face scrunching in concentration. There was a reading corner, with pillows. With big floor pillows shaped like animals, Robert confirmed. You always tried to get the elephant one. Leo opened his eyes, looking almost surprised. I remembered something real? The hope in his voice made Robert's throat tight. Yes, Leo. That was real. Leo's discovery of a real memory seemed to open something in him. Over the next few visits, he started asking more questions, though always carefully, as if testing the ground before each step. Did we have a dog? He asked one morning, breaking a long silence.
No, Robert answered honestly.
You wanted one, but your mom was allergic. We had a goldfish named Splash, though. You won him at a school carnival. Leo's brow furrowed. He died. Yes. Robert watched his son's face carefully. You were devastated. We had a funeral in the backyard and planted flowers over where we buried him. Yellow flowers, Leo said softly. Marigolds. That's right. Robert felt his heart racing. These moments of memory were coming more frequently now, but they still took him by surprise. They bloomed every year after that. You said they were Splash's way of saying hello. Leo nodded slowly, processing this. Then his face changed, clouding over. But at the compound, they said pets were unclean. That wanting them was a sign of weakness. His hand started their familiar twisting. How can both things be true? They can't be, Robert said gently. The people at the compound, they had their own beliefs. But that doesn't make those beliefs true. They said that too, about the outside world, that we couldn't trust anything from before. Leo's voice had taken on that formal tone again, the one he used when quoting compound teachings. That our previous memories were contaminated. Robert felt the familiar surge of anger, but kept his voice calm. Leo, do you remember what we talked about with the photos? About how real memories leave traces. Yes. Well, think about Splash. We don't just have one memory of him. We have the carnival where you won him, feeding him every day, the funeral, the flowers that came back every year. It's all connected, like links in a chain. Leo seemed to consider this. At the compound, everything was separate, like islands.
No connections.
It was one of the most insightful things Leo had said about his time there. Robert wanted to push further, but he saw Leo's hands getting more agitated. Would you like to take a break? He asked. We could walk in the garden. They'd started doing this recently, short walks when the room felt too small or the memories too heavy. Leo nodded, and they made their way outside. The facility's garden was well maintained, with winding paths and benches placed in quiet corners. They walked in silence for a while, Leo keeping a careful distance between them until they reached a small pond with water lilies. Dr. Matthews says I should write things down, Leo said suddenly. The memories when they come. She says it might help me see patterns. That sounds like a good idea. But what if? Leo stopped walking, staring at the pond. What if I write down something that isn't real? Then you write that down too, Robert said. Maybe seeing everything written out will help you spot the difference. Leo picked up a fallen leaf, turning it over in his hands. They had us write things at the compound too. Every day, we had to write out the teachings, over and over until they were perfect. His voice had gone distant again. If we made a mistake, they would make us start over. Robert waited, sensing there was more. Sometimes, Leo continued, his voice barely a whisper, I would write things from before, little things I remembered, but they said that was resistance, that I was fighting against purification. The leaf crumbled in his tightening grip. They would make me burn the papers and write the teachings again. Robert felt sick. He thought of Leo, younger and more vulnerable, being forced to destroy his own memories, to doubt his own mind. The cruelty of it was staggering. Leo, he said softly, what they did to you was wrong. Writing down your memories isn't resistance, it's healing. Leo let the crumbled leaf fall into the pond, watching the pieces float away. How do you know? Because healing lets you think for yourself, makes you stronger. What they did was about control, making you weaker, more dependent on them. Robert paused, choosing his next words carefully. Real love doesn't need to control you. Leo's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Robert's for the first time that day. Something passed across his face, recognition, maybe, or a realization. Then he looked away again, but his posture was different, less rigid. Can we go back inside? He asked. I'd like to write some things down. Of course. As they walked back, Robert noticed that Leo's hands were steady, the constant twisting temporarily stilled. It was a small thing, but in this journey of tiny steps forward and occasional steps back, small things meant everything. Back in the blue room, Leo asked for paper and a pen. Robert watched as his son began to write, his handwriting neat and precise. Another habit from the compound, probably, but his words his own.
Free. Real.
It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the beginning of something like it. The notebook became Leo's constant companion. Robert would arrive each morning to find him already writing, his pen moving steadily across the pages. Sometimes Leo would share what he'd written, small memories that surfaced like bubbles in still water. A blue bicycle, the taste of chocolate ice cream, the sound of rain on his bedroom window. Other times, he'd keep the notebook closed, but Robert could see torn edges where pages had been removed. Dr. Matthews explained that Leo sometimes wrote about the compound, about memories he wasn't ready to share. Those pages would end up in her office, part of their therapy sessions. But as autumn crept closer, something began to change. Leo started smiling more, small, hesitant smiles that reminded Robert of early spring flowers, tentative but hopeful. He asked more questions about his life before, about school and friends and family traditions. One morning, Leo looked up from his notebook with an expression Robert hadn't seen before, something almost like excitement. I remembered something, he said, his voice stronger than usual, about Christmas. Robert leaned forward, trying to contain his own excitement. What did you remember? We had this ornament, a glass penguin. It was special because Leo's forehead creased in concentration. Because Mom bought it the year she got sick. Yes, Robert had to grip his chair to keep from reaching out to hug his son. She bought it that October, just before she went into the hospital. Said we needed something to look forward to. Leo's smile grew slightly. I was afraid to hang it. Thought I'd break it. You made me lift you up so you could put it on the highest branch you could reach, Robert said. Said it needed to be where Santa would definitely see it. Is it? Leo hesitated.
Do we still have it?
Of course. It's wrapped in tissue paper in the Christmas box. We can. Robert paused, suddenly uncertain. They hadn't discussed Leo coming home yet. Dr. Carter had warned against pushing too hard, too fast. We can look at it sometime if you want. Leo nodded, then surprised Robert by asking, could we look at it today? Robert stared at his son, his heart pounding. Today? Dr. Matthews said. Leo's hands did their familiar twist, but it seemed more from excitement than anxiety now. She said I might be ready for a short visit. Just for an hour or two. If that's okay? Robert had to swallow hard before he could speak. Of course it's okay. It's more than okay. I'll need to check with Dr. Carter, but I already did, Leo said, showing another small smile. He said you could take me after lunch. If you want to.
If you want to.
As if there was any question. Robert had been waiting for this moment for weeks, months, years. But he kept his voice calm, remembering Dr. Carter's warnings about overwhelming Leo. I'd like that very much. They arranged the details with Dr. Carter, a 2-hour visit, with Leo's phone on and Dr. Matthews on call if needed. Robert spent the time before lunch practically vibrating with nervous energy, making calls to Jenny, who cried, cleaning up the living room, moving his research board to the basement, and generally trying not to let his hopes soar too high. When he picked Leo up after lunch, his son was wearing one of his gray sweaters but had combed his hair differently, making him look younger, more like the boy in the photos. He carried his notebook and sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the familiar streets pass by. The trees are different, he said as they turned onto their street. Bigger. 5 years of growth, Robert said. Nature doesn't stop for us. They pulled into the driveway, and Robert watched Leo's face carefully. His son was staring at the house, his expression unreadable.
The door was blue, Leo said.
Now it's green. I painted it last year, Robert said. I needed something to do with my hands. Leo nodded, understanding more than Robert had said. They sat in the car for a moment longer, both gathering courage. Ready? Robert asked. Another nod, and they got out of the car. Leo's steps were measured as they approached the house, his hands steady at his sides. Robert fumbled slightly with the keys. Why were his hands shaking now, after all this time? And then the door was open. Leo stood in the doorway looking around. The house smelled of coffee, and the cookies Jenny had stress-baked yesterday. Robert had left some family photos up but removed others, trying to find a balance between familiar and overwhelming. It's smaller, Leo said softly. I remembered it being bigger. Everything seems bigger when you're younger. Leo took a few steps inside, his hand trailing along the wall. He stopped at a mark in the doorframe to the kitchen, pencil lines showing heights and dates, the last one from just 2 months before he disappeared. You used to make me stand really straight, he said, touching the highest mark. Said no cheating allowed. You always try to stand on your tiptoes anyway. A real smile then. Small but genuine. I wanted to be tall like you. Well, you got your wish, Robert said, noting how his sons had nearly reached the top of the doorframe now. You might end up taller than me. Leo moved through the house like someone exploring an old dream, touching things gently. The kitchen counter, the back of the couch, the banister of the stairs. Robert followed at a distance, watching his son rediscover their home. The Christmas boxes are in the attic, Robert said. Would you like to look for that ornament? Leo hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, his hand tightening on the banister. Is my room still up there? Yes. Robert kept his voice neutral, though his heart was racing. Would you like to see it? Another pause, then a nod. They climbed the stairs together, Leo's footsteps careful and measured. The second floorboard from the top still creaked. Leo stepped over it automatically, then stopped, surprised by his own muscle memory. His bedroom door was closed. Robert had kept it that way, cleaning it regularly but otherwise leaving it untouched. Leo stood in front of it, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Take your time, Robert said softly. Leo opened the door slowly. The room was exactly as he'd left it that last morning. Bed made because Sarah had always insisted on it. Pokémon posters on the walls. Telescope by the window pointing at stars long since moved on. It's all still here, Leo whispered. Of course it is. It's your room. Leo stepped inside, turning in a slow circle. His eyes landed on his bookshelf, the collection of novels and comics he'd loved. He walked over and pulled out a well-worn copy of The Hobbit. I was reading this, he said. Before. You were halfway through. You kept telling me about the riddles in the dark. Leo opened the book, finding the bookmark still in place. At the compound, they said reading fiction was dangerous, that it put corrupt ideas in your head. His voice had taken on that distant tone again. They burned all the books except their teachings. Robert felt the familiar anger rise, but kept it out of his voice. What do you think about that now? Leo ran his fingers over the book's pages. I think they were afraid of stories. Because stories help you imagine different ways of thinking. He looked up at Robert. Is that why they didn't want us to remember our old lives? Because those were like stories too. That's very insightful, Leo. Robert leaned against the doorframe, giving his son space. Stories help us understand ourselves and others. They help us know what's real and what's not. Leo put the book back carefully and moved to his desk. The surface was dusty despite Robert's cleaning, but Leo's science fair trophy still stood proudly next to his pencil holder. First place, he said, touching the trophy, for the project about plant growth. You grew beans in different types of soil, Robert said. Kept measurements for weeks. The compound had a garden, Leo said, his voice getting that formal edge again. But we weren't allowed to experiment. Everything had to be done exactly the way they said. He turned away from the desk abruptly, his hands starting their familiar twisting. Can we look for the ornament now? Robert recognized the signs of overwhelm. They'd learned them together over these past weeks. Of course, the attic's right up here. They found the Christmas boxes tucked under the eaves. Robert pulled out the one marked ornaments and opened it carefully. The penguin was right on top, still wrapped in its tissue paper nest. Leo took it with trembling hands, unwrapping it slowly. The glass caught the afternoon light, sending tiny rainbows across his face. Mom said it was perfect, he said softly, because penguins mate for life, like her and Dad. He looked up suddenly. That's real, right? I didn't make that up? That's real, Robert confirmed. She loved penguins almost as much as you did. Leo rewrapped the ornament carefully. Could we put it on a tree this Christmas? The question hit Robert like a physical force. This Christmas. Leo was thinking about the future, making plans. I'd like that very much. They put the boxes away and headed back downstairs. Leo seemed tired now, the emotional weight of the visit showing in his slightly slumped shoulders. Ready to head back? Robert asked. Leo nodded, but at the door he stopped, looking back into the house. Dad. It was the first time he'd called Robert that since coming back. Robert had to grip the doorframe to stay steady. Yes, thank you. For keeping everything. For not giving up. Robert wanted to hug his son, to hold him close and never let go. But he knew they weren't there yet. Instead, he said simply, I'll never give up on you, Leo. The drive back to the facility was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Leo held his notebook but didn't write, just looked out the window at the familiar streets passing by. It felt like a victory. It felt like hope. Neither of them knew it was about to shatter. The change came suddenly, like a storm breaking from a clear sky. The day after their house visit, Leo wasn't in the blue room for their usual meeting. Instead, Dr. Carter was waiting, his face grave. Leo had a difficult night, he said, gesturing for Robert to sit. The visit seems to have triggered some memories. Robert's stomach clenched. Bad ones. Very. Dr. Carter removed his glasses, cleaning them with deliberate movements. He had what we call a breakthrough crisis. Sometimes, when patients start to accept their real memories, it also breaks down the walls holding back the traumatic ones. What kind of traumatic ones? Robert's voice was barely a whisper. Leo spent most of the night writing. Dr. Carter pulled out a folder. He gave permission for me to share this with you, but I want to prepare you. It's difficult reading. The pages inside were covered in Leo's neat handwriting, but there was something frantic about it, like the words had been pushed onto the paper with too much force. They made us watch. The first page began. Every time someone was purified, we had to sit in the circle and watch. If you looked away, you were next. Jimmy looked away once. We never saw him again. Robert's hands started shaking. Purified. It seems to have been their punishment ritual, Dr. Carter said quietly, for what they called resistance to the truth. Robert forced himself to keep reading. The water was always cold. They said heat would comfort the corruption. Sometimes they'd hold us under until everything went dark. When we came up, they'd make us recite the teachings. If we got them wrong, we went back under. The coffee he'd had earlier threatened to come back up. They tortured children? They called it purification, Dr. Carter said. But yes, essentially. The second father would choose. Leo's writing continued. He'd walk around the circle, touching heads. If he chose you, it meant the corruption was winning. The only way to fight it was to purify yourself, to prove you were strong enough to belong to the true family. Second father? The leader of the compound, Dr. Carter explained. They had a whole hierarchy: second father, third mother, the purifiers. They created a twisted version of family structure to replace the children's real families. Robert read on, each word feeling like a knife. Leo wrote about isolation rooms where children were kept in darkness for days, about being forced to cleanse themselves of memories by writing them down and burning them, about watching other children break under the constant pressure to prove their loyalty. Where are these people now? Robert asked, his voice rough with suppressed rage. Most were arrested in the raid, but some, including the second father, escaped. Dr. Carter put his glasses back on. That's part of what triggered Leo's crisis. He saw a news report about the ongoing manhunt. It made everything feel more real.
How?
Robert had to stop, breathe. How is he now? Sedated, for the moment. Dr. Matthews is with him. He's been alternating between periods of extreme agitation and complete withdrawal. Dr. Carter leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you something difficult. In his writings, Leo mentioned a specific date. October 12th, about 3 years ago. Were you anywhere near Wisconsin at that time? Robert thought back. No, I was in Boston following a lead. Why? Dr. Carter's face grew even more serious. Because Leo writes about seeing you there at the compound. He says the second father brought you in to test his loyalty. That's impossible. I was nowhere near there. We know. But Leo's memory of it is very clear. He describes you begging him to come home, saying you'd forgiven him for being corrupt. Then he describes watching as the second father. Dr. Carter paused. As the second father had you purified. The room seemed to tilt. They made him think he watched me die. They used his memories of you, combined with their purification rituals, to create a false memory. It was their way of severing his connection to his past completely. In Leo's mind, you were dead, punished for trying to corrupt him back to his false family. Robert felt sick. All those times Leo had looked at him with confusion, with fear, he hadn't just been struggling with real versus false memories. He'd been seeing a ghost. That's why he was so formal, Robert realized. So distant. He thought you couldn't be real, Dr. Carter confirmed. Part of him has been waiting for you to disappear, to prove you're just another trick of his mind. What do we do now? Now that this memory has surfaced, we can work on processing it. Help Leo understand it was a manipulation tactic. Dr. Carter's voice softened. But it won't be easy. This kind of psychological trauma runs deep. Can I see him? Not today. He needs time to stabilize. But he did ask me to give you something. Dr. Carter pulled out one more piece of paper from the folder. Unlike the others, this one was written in shaky, uneven letters. Dad, I remember watching you die. But you're alive. If you're alive, what else did they lie about? Everything's broken in my head. I'm sorry. Please don't give up on me. Robert pressed his hand to his mouth, fighting back tears. Tell him I meant what I said yesterday. I'll never give up on him. Dr. Carter nodded. Would you like to write him a note back? Robert took the offered pen, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote. Leo, I'm here. I'm real. And I'll be here tomorrow and the next day and every day after that. We'll figure this out together. I promise. Dad. It wasn't enough. How could any words be enough against the weight of what had been done to his son? But it was all he could offer right now. This simple promise of presence, of persistence, of love that wouldn't disappear. For 3 days, Robert wasn't allowed to see Leo. He came to the facility anyway, sitting in the waiting room with his own notebook, writing down everything he could remember about where he'd been during Leo's missing years. He needed proof, not just for Leo, but for himself now. Proof that he'd been searching, not suffering in some compound basement. On the 4th day, Dr. Matthews found him there. He's asking for you, she said. But I need to warn you, he's different. The medications we have him on, they help with the anxiety, but they make him a bit disconnected. She led him not to the blue room, but to Leo's actual room in the residential wing. It was small but bright, with a window overlooking the garden. Leo sat in a chair by the window, still in his gray sweater, but now wrapped in a thick blanket despite the warm day. His notebook lay closed on the windowsill. "Hey, Dad," he said softly, not turning from the window. The word Dad still felt new, fragile. "Hey, Leo." Robert sat in the other chair, noting how Leo's hands lay still in his lap, not their usual restless dance, but an artificial stillness from the medication. "How are you feeling?" "Fuzzy. Like everything's underwater." Leo finally turned to look at him. His eyes were slightly unfocused. "You're still here. Always will be. I watched you die." Leo said it matter-of-factly, like commenting on the weather. "In the purification circle, you turned blue." Robert's heart clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "I was in Boston that day, Leo. I have proof, hotel receipts, PI reports, security camera footage. I was following a lead about a missing kid in Massachusetts. It wasn't you." Leo nodded slowly. "Dr. Matthews says they used something called suggestive imagery. Made us see things that weren't there." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Jimmy didn't really turn into smoke when they purified him, did he?" "No, honey.
He didn't.
I think." Leo's hands twitched, fighting against the medication's calming effect. "I think maybe Jimmy just disappeared, like the others who resisted. They took them away at night." Robert wanted to gather his son in his arms, to protect him from these memories. But he stayed still, letting Leo talk. Second Father would say they'd been taken to a higher level of enlightenment, that if we were pure enough, we'd see them again. Leo's voice had that mechanical quality again, reciting from memory. But sometimes we could hear screaming from the basement. "Leo," Robert said gently, "you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to." "I need to." Leo's fingers gripped the blanket. "Because if you're alive, then everything else might be different too. Maybe Jimmy didn't disappear. Maybe he got away. Maybe he's home with his family too. The police are looking for everyone who was there," Robert said. "They're going to find them all, the missing kids and the people who did this." Second Father got away though. For the first time, real fear crept into Leo's voice. "I saw him on the news. He's still out there. He can't hurt you anymore. This place is secure and there are police watching." But he said, Leo's breathing quickened. He said corruption always calls to corruption. That if we ever left, we'd find our way back. That the true family was the only pure place in the world. "Leo, look at me." Robert waited until his son's eyes met his. "Everything he told you was a lie. Every single thing. He wasn't trying to make you pure. He was trying to control you, to break you down and rebuild you the way he wanted." "But what if some of it wasn't lies?" Leo's voice cracked. "What if I am corrupted? Sometimes I still hear his voice in my head, telling me this isn't real, that I'm failing the test, that I'll never be pure enough to dash." "Stop." Robert did reach out then, taking his son's cold hand. Leo flinched but didn't pull away. "You are not corrupted. You're hurt. There's a difference. And you're not failing anything by being here, by remembering, by telling the truth." "How do you know?" "Because the truth doesn't need to hurt people to be true. It doesn't need to break them or frighten them or make them doubt themselves." Robert squeezed Leo's hand gently. "The truth is that you're my son. That I love you. That nothing they did or said can change that." Leo looked at their joined hands. "Even if I can't, even if I'm never completely better? Even then, especially then." A tear slipped down Leo's cheek, then another. "I'm so tired, Dad. I'm tired of not knowing what's real. I'm tired of being afraid." "I know." Robert felt his own eyes burning. "But you're not alone anymore. And we're going to figure this out together, one real thing at a time." Leo nodded, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Robert held his hand and watched the sun set outside the window, casting long shadows across the garden where a robin, maybe the same one from before, hopped across the grass, searching for its evening meal. Real things. They would build their way back to truth with real things, one small piece at a time. The next few weeks brought a new routine. Leo stayed in his room most days, working with Dr. Matthews in the mornings and seeing Robert in the afternoons. The heavy medications were gradually reduced, and Leo's hands slowly returned to their restless movement, though less frantically than before. They started making lists together, concrete things they could prove were real. Robert brought documents, photographs, videos on his phone. Each piece of evidence they added to Leo's notebook, building a foundation of truth to stand on. "Tell me about the day I disappeared," Leo said one afternoon. He'd moved from the chair to sitting cross-legged on his bed, his notebook open in front of him. "I need to know what really happened." Robert took a deep breath. They hadn't talked about this yet. Dr. Matthews had said to wait until Leo asked.
It was a Tuesday, he began.
"You had a science test that day. You were nervous about it, but you'd studied hard. I made pancakes for breakfast because you said they were brain food." Leo's pen moved across the page, recording each detail. "What was I wearing?" "Blue jeans, your Pokemon t-shirt, the one with Pikachu on it. New sneakers we'd bought the weekend before." Robert could see it all so clearly, even now. "You forgot your lunch, so I brought it to school during my break. That was the last time." He had to stop, the memory threatening to overwhelm him. Leo looked up from his writing. "You brought my lunch?"
Yeah.
"Turkey sandwich, apple, and those cookies you liked, the ones with M&Ms in them." Leo's hands stilled on the notebook. "I remember the cookies. You left a note." Robert's heart jumped.
Yes.
I drew a little smiley face and wrote dash. "Ace that test, scientist." Leo said it with him, then looked surprised at himself. "That's real?" "That's real. The police still have the note, actually. It was in your lunchbox when they found it." "Found it where?" "Behind the school gym, along with your backpack." Robert kept his voice steady, clinical. "You never came back to class after lunch break. The security cameras showed you walking toward the playground, but there was a blind spot. They never saw what happened next." Leo's hands started moving again, twisting the pages of his notebook. "I remember a van. White. Someone asked for help finding their dog." "You don't have to talk about this if you're not ready." "No, I need to know." Leo's voice was stronger now. "They gave me something to drink. Said it would help us look for the dog. It made everything fuzzy." His breathing quickened. "When I woke up, I was in a dark room. They kept saying I was home now, that everything before was a dream, that I needed to forget to become pure." Robert wanted to stop him, to protect him from these memories, but he knew Leo needed to say it. "They kept me in the dark for, I don't know how long. No food, no water, just darkness, and their voices telling me over and over that my old life wasn't real." Leo's hands were shaking now. "When they finally let me out, everything seemed so bright, so strange. They said that was proof, that the world I remembered couldn't be real, because it looked different now." "Sleep deprivation and sensory manipulation," Robert said quietly. "The police found records of their methods when they raided the compound. There were others in the dark rooms too. I could hear them crying." Leo looked up suddenly. "Did they find their families too?" "Some of them. The police are still looking for others." "And the ones who disappeared? The ones they took to the basement?" Robert hesitated. "They'd found things in that basement, things he never wanted Leo to know about. They're still investigating." Leo seemed to understand what he wasn't saying. His hands twisted harder in the notebook pages. "I should have helped them. The ones they took. I should have done something."
Leo, no.
Robert moved to sit on the edge of the bed, careful to keep some distance. "You were a child. You were being tortured, brainwashed. None of what happened was your fault. But I believed them. After a while, I started believing everything they said. I even helped them sometimes with the newer kids, telling them their families weren't real, that they needed to forget." His voice broke. "What does that make me?" "It makes you a survivor," Robert said firmly. "You did what you had to do to stay alive. No one can blame you for that. The other kids might. Their families might. Listen to me." Robert waited until Leo met his eyes. "What they did to you, to all of you, It was designed to break you down completely, to make you doubt everything, even your own mind. The fact that you survived it, that you're here now, working to understand what happened, that makes you incredibly strong. Leo looked down at his notebook, at the lists of real things they'd been building. But what if I'm never completely better? What if I always have trouble knowing what's real? Then we'll keep making lists, Robert said simply. We'll keep finding proof. And on the days when everything feels uncertain, I'll be here to remind you. Even if it takes years, even if it takes forever. Leo nodded slowly, turning to a new page in his notebook. Can you tell me more about that Tuesday? I want to write down everything, even the hard parts. So Robert told him, piece by piece, every detail of that last normal morning. The way Leo had stumbled downstairs still half asleep. The syrup puddle he'd made with his pancakes. The argument about wearing a jacket because it looked like rain. Normal moments.
Real moments.
The kind they'd never take for granted again. As autumn deepened, Leo's questions became more focused, more specific. He wasn't just asking about what was real anymore. He was trying to understand why things were real, how to tell the difference between truth and manipulation. Did you ever think about stopping? He asked one gray afternoon. They were sitting in the garden, despite the chill. Leo had started preferring it out here, where he could see the sky. Looking for me, I mean. Robert watched a leaf spiral down from a nearby maple.
No.
Never. But everyone else did, didn't they? The police, the other searchers. They didn't stop exactly. They just moved on to other cases. Other missing kids. Leo pulled his sweater tighter around himself. He'd started wearing blue ones sometimes now, a small rebellion against the compound's enforced gray. The compound taught us that persistence was a sign of corruption, that letting go was pure. Of course they did, Robert said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Because they didn't want anyone looking for you. But you did anyway. I did anyway. Leo was quiet for a moment, watching another leaf fall. Dr. Matthews says that's how I can tell what's real. By looking at why people do things, not just what they do. What do you mean? Well, like... Leo's hands did their familiar dance, but it was thoughtful now rather than anxious. The compound said they were helping us by making us forget our families. But really, they were helping themselves by making us easier to control. Robert nodded, encouraging him to continue. But you looked for me because... Leo paused, struggling with the concept. Because that's what love does. It doesn't give up? That's right. Even when I was telling the new kids their families weren't real. Even when I helped with the purification circles. Even then. Robert turned to face his son fully. Leo, nothing you did in there could make me stop loving you. Nothing. Leo's hands stilled. I think that's how I know you're really my dad. Because the second father's love always had conditions. It could be taken away if we weren't pure enough. But yours. Mine is unconditional, Robert finished. Always has been, always will be. A ghost of a smile touched Leo's lips. That's a real thing, isn't it? Unconditional love. The realist. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the leaves fall. Then Leo said, so quietly Robert almost missed it. I think I'm ready to try going home. Robert's heart jumped, but he kept his voice steady. Yeah? What made you decide? Something Dr. Matthews said. About how healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry the hard things while still moving forward. Leo looked at his hands. I'm tired of being stuck. I want to move forward. Are you sure you're ready? No, Leo admitted.
I'm scared.
But that's real too, right? Being scared but doing something anyway. That's called courage. Then I want to be courageous. Leo's voice strengthened. I want to sleep in my own room again. I want to help you paint the door back to blue. He stopped, his hands twisting again. What do you want, Leo? I want to be your son again, not just someone who looks like him. Robert had to take a deep breath to steady his voice. You've always been my son, even when you couldn't remember it, even when you thought I wasn't real. But it's different now. Leo looked up at the sky, where clouds were gathering for rain. Before, I was just trying to figure out what was real. Now I want to be real. Really me, not who they tried to make me. And who is that? The real you? I'm not sure yet. Leo's hands finally stilled. But I think he's someone who doesn't give up. Like his dad. Robert felt tears threatening and didn't try to hide them. Takes after his mom that way too. She was the most stubborn person I ever knew. Tell me about her? Leo asked. Not just the facts this time. Tell me what she was like as a person. So Robert did, watching his son's face as he described Sarah's laugh, her terrible cooking, her habit of singing off-key to radio commercials. With each detail, Leo wrote in his notebook, but he was smiling now, small, real smiles that reached his eyes. They were building something new, Robert realized. Not trying to recover the past exactly, but creating a future where both the good memories and the hard ones could exist together. Where healing didn't mean forgetting, but understanding. It wasn't the victory he'd imagined 5 years ago. It was better. It was real. Moving day came on a crisp October morning. Leo's belongings fit in a single duffel bag, some clothes, his notebooks, and a few books from the facility's library. It seemed too small to represent 6 months of healing, but then again, the most important changes weren't things you could pack. Dr. Matthews had helped them make a plan. Leo would have twice-weekly therapy sessions, with emergency phone support available anytime. They'd established routines, backup plans, safe words for when things got overwhelming. Robert had learned the signs of an impending panic attack, how to help Leo ground himself when memories became too intense. Remember, Dr. Matthews said as they signed the discharge papers, this isn't an ending. It's just a change of location for your healing journey. Leo nodded, his hands steady on the papers. He was wearing a blue sweater today, not gray, not ever gray again. I know, and I can come back if I need to. Anytime, she assured him. But I don't think you'll need to. You're ready for this next step. The drive home felt different from their previous visits. Leo sat straighter in the passenger seat, looking forward instead of out the side window. His notebook was in his lap, but closed. Today wasn't for writing, it was for living. Jenny wants to bring dinner over, Robert said as they turned onto their street. But I told her it's your choice. We can have a quiet first night if you prefer. Leo considered this. Is she making her lasagna? Of course. It's your favorite. It is, isn't it? Leo said this with a hint of wonder, still sometimes surprised by remembering simple preferences. Yeah, that would be nice. But maybe just Jenny? Not everyone at once. Just Jenny, Robert agreed.
They pulled into the driveway.
The door was blue again. They'd painted it last weekend during a day visit, Leo insisting on doing most of the work himself. He'd been quiet that day, focused entirely on each brushstroke, like he was painting away the years of absence. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and pine cleaner. Robert had spent days getting everything ready, making sure there were no surprise triggers, no gray clothes in the laundry, no newspapers with stories about the compound, no sudden noises or dark corners. Leo stood in the entryway, taking deep breaths like Dr. Matthews had taught him. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. You okay? Robert asked.
Yeah.
Leo's hands did their dance briefly, then stilled. Just making sure I'm here. Really here. Want to check your room? I got those constellation sheets you liked. They climbed the stairs together, Leo automatically stepping over the creaky board again. His room looked different now. They'd worked on it during his day visits, slowly making changes. The Pokemon posters were still up, but joined by new ones, science diagrams, space photos, things that represented who Leo was becoming, not just who he'd been. The telescope was clean and repositioned, pointing at where Saturn would be visible tonight, if the clouds cleared. His books were arranged on the shelves, the worn copy of The Hobbit now joined by newer ones. The bookmark was still in place, but Leo had said he wanted to start from the beginning again. Look, Leo said, pointing to his window. A robin, maybe their garden friend, was perched on the outside sill, tilting its head at them. Welcome committee, Robert said. Leo smiled, a real smile, the kind that was coming more frequently now. Think it's the same one from the facility? Could be. Birds are smart that way. Leo went to the window, moving slowly to avoid startling the bird. It stayed put, watching him with bright eyes. At the compound, Leo said quietly, they never let us feed the birds. Said it was wasteful. He turned to Robert. Could we get a bird feeder? Of course. We can set it up this weekend. Leo nodded, then said something that made Robert's heart skip. Maybe we could get a dog too? Eventually? It was the first time Leo had talked about the future in terms of wants rather than fears. When you're ready, we can look into that. Not yet, Leo said quickly. But someday, when things feel more solid. Whenever you want, kiddo. Leo ran his hand along his desk, touching the science fair trophy, the pencil holder, the new laptop they'd bought for his upcoming online classes. It's weird, he said. Everything's the same, but different. Like me, I guess. That's not a bad thing. No, Leo agreed. I think maybe different is okay. As long as it's real different, not compound different. The robin chirped once and flew away, leaving them in comfortable silence. Want to help me make coffee? Robert asked. Jenny won't be here for a few hours. Real coffee? Leo asked with another small smile. Not the compounds, purified herb water. Real coffee. Strong enough to wake the dead. That's why you're still here then, Leo said, and for a moment Robert's heart stopped, but then he saw the glint in his son's eyes. A joke. Leo had made a joke about the compound's lies. Robert laughed, relief making him slightly dizzy. Caught me. The coffee and stubbornness, that's my secret. They headed downstairs together, Leo's steps sure and steady. In the kitchen, he went straight to the cabinet where the coffee mugs were kept. Muscle memory again, small certainties returning day by day. As winter approached, their days fell into new patterns. Leo started his online classes, working at his own pace, rebuilding the education the compound had tried to replace with their teachings. He was particularly drawn to science, just like before, but now with a deeper appreciation for the way it helped explain reality. You can prove things in science, he told Robert one evening as they worked on his physics homework. There's no room for because I said so. Everything has to be tested. They kept their lists going, but they were different now. Instead of just recording memories and proof of what was real, Leo started writing about the future. Small goals at first. Make it through a whole day without checking if Robert is real, sleep with the lights off, walk to the corner store alone. Then bigger ones, start running again, maybe try in-person classes next year, learn to drive someday. The nightmares didn't stop completely. Sometimes Robert would wake to the sound of Leo's voice down the hall, fighting invisible enemies in his sleep. But now, when Leo called out, he called for his dad, not second father, not the purifiers, but his real dad who would come and sit with him until the darkness passed. Jenny became a regular presence again, coming over for dinner twice a week. She never pushed, never asked too many questions, just brought her lasagna and her gentle humor and her way of making everything feel a little more normal. Leo started helping her cook, learning the family recipes that had skipped 5 years of his life. Your mom was terrible in the kitchen, Jenny told him as they made cookies one afternoon. But she could bake like nobody's business. These are her recipe, actually. Leo carefully measured the vanilla. Dad told me about how she used to sing to the radio. Oh God, yes. Totally tone deaf, but didn't care one bit. Used to drive your dad crazy, especially on road trips. These stories didn't hurt like they used to. Instead, they felt like bridges, connecting who Leo had been with who he was becoming. Each memory was another piece of reality to hold on to. The compound's influence didn't disappear entirely. Leo still wore his clothes carefully pressed, still sat with perfect posture, still slipped sometimes into their formal way of speaking. But now he could catch himself doing it, could choose to relax, to be messy, to use slang like any other teenager. When the police finally caught second father in a small town in Canada, Leo watched the news report with steady hands. He looked smaller, was all he said. Less powerful. They went to the trial together. Leo insisted on testifying, even though they said they had enough evidence without him. Some things need to be said out loud, he told Robert. So they're real for everyone, not just in our heads. He spoke for 3 hours, his voice clear and strong, describing everything they'd done. When he finished, the judge had tears in her eyes, and second father wouldn't look at him. Power, it seemed, couldn't survive in the light of truth. Christmas came, and they put up the tree together. The glass penguin ornament went right in front, where everyone could see it. Leo hung it himself, no fear of breaking it now. His hands were steady with this piece of his past, this proof of continuation. The dog came in spring, a gentle rescue mutt with one ear that flopped wrong and a tail that never stopped wagging. Leo named him Bilbo, after the hobbit who went on an unexpected journey and came back changed but whole. "Do you think we'll ever be normal?" Leo asked one night as they sat on the back porch, watching Bilbo chase fireflies. "Like other families?" Robert considered this.
What's normal anyway?
Every family has their stuff, their history. Ours is just more dramatic than most. Leo smiled, a full smile now, not the careful ones from before. "I guess. It's just sometimes I still get scared. That I'll wake up and this won't be real, that I'll be back there. That's okay. Being scared doesn't make this less real. Neither does having bad days or needing help sometimes."
Yeah.
Leo watched Bilbo flop down at his feet, panting happily. "I think I'm starting to understand that. Real doesn't mean perfect. It just means true." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Inside, Jenny was cleaning up from dinner, humming off-key just like Sarah used to. The porch light cast a gentle glow around them, keeping the shadows at bay without trying to eliminate them completely. This was their victory, Robert realized. Not in forgetting the darkness, but in learning to live with it. Not in erasing the past, but in building something new from its pieces. Their family hadn't gone back to what it was. It had grown into something different, something stronger. Leo leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars.
Dad.
"Yeah, I'm glad we're real." Robert reached over and squeezed his son's hand, a gesture that no longer made Leo flinch. "Me too, kiddo. Me too." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, constant and true. Bilbo chased another firefly. Jenny started singing along to the radio, drifting through the open window. And father and son sat together in the gathering dark, holding onto their piece of reality, one true moment at a time.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.